Good to meet y'all. As Derek mentioned, regularly involved in HeavyBit and MOSIF. I'm a guy who's been deeply involved in APIs for a little over 12 years. And today we're talking about a particular topic on embedded integration frameworks. I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. But yes, I do have a really old and outdated Justin Timberlake pun here. That's actually all that was. What we're basically talking about today when I'm defining the embedded integration frameworks is this is about enabling third parties to work deeply within your own interface, within your own user experience, going beyond APIs and thinking through how else can services really connect with my product in experience and flow that makes sense for my users. Usually I prefer just to skip this, but yeah, I've worked on various developer platforms, including Box, lesser known Tradeshift, and in Modo. I've worked both full-time and as a consultant at several now unicorn companies, building out both APIs and these sort of frameworks where third-party apps are actually part of the experience, which is fundamental for the company's customer retention and often customer adoption. I've also been a mentor, an advisor, yada yada, to a bunch of other startup accelerators on API platform strategy, general product strategy, marketplace strategy, which comes up often when we're talking about these embedded frameworks. We'll get to that. And also from just general startup experience, seeing a lot of companies grow and succeed and others grow and crash and some spectacular failures, just mentoring generally on how not to F up in startup execution. But today we're focusing on product and some technical bits on the embedded integration frameworks. To give some context, I realize this is a crowd who probably knows a lot already about the API ecosystem. Yeah, APIs are really, really popular now. They weren't really popular 10 years ago when I started at Box. Then they got cool, but I'm not a hipster. During this time, there have been some struggles. We've moved away from, say, SOAP APIs, that's almost a curse word now, to JSON, better technology, standards. But we've had our struggles during this time. APIs got popular, they had their growing pains. As they got popular, some APIs were launched without really a product plan. It was just because of hype. And now things are balancing out. And during that little bit of wackiness, during this growth, something seemed to have been forgotten between 2008, 2009, where the API craze started, and now. In that, well, let me start with a couple of examples. Does anyone remember what this thing is? See a couple people laughing. That's when I know how old you are. Okay, this was iGoogle. Google a long time ago had an alternative homepage, a highly customizable homepage. It was supposed to look kind of like an operating system. You could choose these custom things, a clock, a calculator. Some of them were built by third parties, and it was all just this third-party stuff embedded in this cool interface. This was when Ajax was becoming a big deal. How about this one? Raise your hand if you know what this thing was. Anyone? Okay, yeah, one person. So this was something called Open Social. This was basically where Google wanted to enable the iGoogle-like experience in other services, in particular in social networks, to kind of compete with Facebook, actually. LinkedIn, in particular, had a big launch around this. When I was at Box, we were a launch partner. There were about half a dozen of us who were involved in that launch. And no one else ever actually built anything on top of this platform. But the idea here was that you could install, say, the Box app, choose one folder that's going to be your portfolio folder in this integration, and we would then be embedded on your profile page on LinkedIn. So these apps had an interface in LinkedIn's account, so you can interact with the apps privately, and then say, I want to share this on my profile. And there would actually be this iFramed embedded thing of a third party on your LinkedIn profile page, which mysteriously and quietly disappeared. Nobody really remembers it. This is an unfortunate challenge we kind of saw at this time. There was a period for APIs where it was rising and got a little messy. During that time, this got messy too, these embedded integration frameworks, letting third-party stuff happen in your interface. And they all just quietly faded out. I'm happy, though, to see that it was really just a lull, and there's a bit of a resurgence. Let's first look at why this happened. Well, basically what was going on here is a user experience issue. Like Google, a lot of this was about making the web kind of work like an operating system. Actually, there was a service that tried to do that. Does anyone remember UOS? It's a Y Combinator company from a few years ago. It was literally a web page where you could install other apps and launch them on this web page. It was supposed to look like a desktop operating system. It was all just iframing, embedding these third-party apps in this interface. But you could choose these things. It was a nice little marketplace here. It looked like a desktop operating system. Here's the problem. When I'm looking at this, I was actually thinking of building something like this about a year before UOS came out. By enough sense to realize this is cooler than it is valuable. It's nice, the idea of the web as an operating system, but why would I actually want to do everything in one web page? So the web tops, that's what these were called, fundamentally didn't work. From a tech standpoint, they worked, but people didn't really go with it. And that really came to the issue of use cases. If we're going to bring third-party apps into our experience, there has to be a reason for it. Unfortunately, we had initially a bad taste from these kind of things. But this leads to what we've actually seen as a general rule for success in APIs and product in general. That the whole, if you build it, they will come, just doesn't work. We've learned this historically. Sometimes we think, oh yeah, these apps are built that just get a ton of usage, generate viral spread. We know from good product management, it doesn't work that way. You have to create a story, create value, making sure that what you're building is genuinely a solution to a real problem. And by the way, that movie where if you build it, they will come, it's all about these White Sox players, the ones who are actually the most notorious for taking a bribe to throw a World Series. So when you think about it, even in that movie, they attracted the wrong customers. We learned about this in API world. This is why things were messy in the earlier years of the API craze. And eventually we figured out that it's not just build an API and developers are going to come. You have to have a good developer experience. You have to provide real value to developers, give them a reason to work with your APIs. And when it came to APIs, well, developers were forgiving. If it didn't work out for one API, we would still look for other APIs. So things evolved, and as more APIs were developed that were more of a fit, it was okay. We had healthy growth. Unfortunately, for things like Google, it wasn't just a developer-facing issue. When these products failed, they failed in front of the consumers, the customers, your users. They looked bad, and that's why they were all very quietly shut down. It left a bad taste in the market. I'm not going to say who, not going to say where, but at a company that is worth more than $10 billion, one of the companies with whom I partner with at Box, where they quietly shut down their platform, they were interviewing me at one point for a job, and I met one of the founders. The first question was just, what the heck did we do wrong doing this? And they all did understand that it wasn't fundamentally that something was wrong with these with these embedded frameworks, bringing those third parties in. It looked so bad when they first tried it that they had to move away from it. And now we're actually starting to have a comeback by applying a product process in use cases. So as a few examples, I hope that's big enough. You may have seen a few of these in the market today. Over in Gmail, something called add-ons. This is where you may be able to open up Google Calendar in Gmail. Okay, that experience still kind of sucks. But Streak, there are other scheduling tools, email trackers, CRM products are now being embedded inside of Gmail. Originally, we would hack this with Chrome extensions, but now Gmail's open up add-ons you can actually do in their interface. Trello has something called power-ups. They basically enable third parties to be embedded on their boards, but even on individual cards and interacting with their cards. Like poker planning, for those in engineering, when you're doing agile estimates, there are third-party extensions to enable that in Trello. What do these two services do? Well, for a long time, they saw what different people were trying to do with their platforms, with their existing services. What were the feature limitations? What is that mix of things people are trying to do that will require partner integrations, or a bunch of things you don't want to build and maintain yourself? And also, in the case of both of these, what have people been doing to hack your product to make this work? For Gmail, there are many Chrome extensions. There was literally a community of people who were trying to enhance Gmail from outside of Gmail. The same with Trello. There were Chrome extensions that were essentially working around the limitations of these products. I've gotten to speak with these companies and people on these teams who are running the platforms. They've confirmed this. Before they could launch, they needed to see what people were trying to do. Not only was there a limitation they were asking for, but they could see users literally hacking the product to get it to work this way. And that's where they saw obvious opportunity. And so this is why we're starting to see success. Google G Suite's add-ons, Trello, Wix launched something called Corvid. It's actually targeting more hardcore developers to run server-side code and basically launch apps within Wix. Shopify has a massive ecosystem that involves embedding in their experience. And even Twitch has a very creative platform that allows gamers to actually provide enhancements to the experience to communicate between them and their viewers. I got to actually interview all of these to gather more feedback as to what are they experimenting with, what have they learned, how do they start, why do they launch their platforms. They're all generating successful results. They're all still experimenting. We're going to see some of the tests they're running. But also, they have been consistently engaged in their customer base to say what do they need, and then we'll enable that for third parties to build. And that gives a clue as to something else we don't want to do here. So to summarize, what did they all learn from working on these platforms successfully? First, don't just plop integration options like iFrames. Don't just enable third parties in your interface somewhere because you think it's cool. Otherwise, you're just going to be someone who looks cool back in the 80s. And we all know that the 80s just wasn't cool. And again, have real use cases. Don't actually enable this until you know that there's something missing in your product that users are asking for. I have to emphasize that because before that, you also have to think from a marketplace standpoint here. This isn't worth launching unless you have a good number of users already. It seems like an obvious thing. When we actually look at the value proposition for embedding apps in your experience, what are the value points for most APIs? There are a lot of value points. Sometimes the APIs and integrations give us partners who are going to bring us new customers. So it could be about growth, about new customer adoption. Other times it's about solving a problem that our customers have. That's more the marketplace model. We already have our customers. We're bringing in a partner to work with our customers. And when it comes to these embedded frameworks, pretty much all the time, it's about the marketplace. So there's really no point in launching these unless you already have users. Seems obvious, but I am going to make fun of a few companies that got into the hype 10 years ago about these embedded frameworks, and they had less than 1 million users, only a percentage were active. They'd be promising all their partners that they were going to get millions of dollars and all these new users because they thought by having this marketplace and all of these partners, they were going to bring users. Doesn't work that way. Little secret to embedded frameworks, it's a marketplace model, and it's mostly about customer retention, not customer adoption or customer growth. So you first have to get your users, then get your feedback, and then it's actually going to make sense to launch one of these. That's why so many failed in the past. But today is not about business talk as much. Let's get into product and design. So I was mentioning iFrames quite often. That's the most common option for implementing a developer platform as an embedded framework. There are actually quite a few. I'm going to highlight just the top 3 that we've seen as trending, working ways to enable third parties to be part of your interface. The first and most common being iFrames, which I assume this audience is fairly familiar with, but it's basically letting another website be embedded in your website. Cards, we're going to dive into this a little bit more, but it's a more controlled experience. We're not going to say people can just load JavaScript and whatever they want on your website. And triggers, I'm actually going to call that more miscellaneous. This is where we're just going to get creative and see what else can we do to enable third parties to be in our interface. So diving in here a little bit, let's first get into iFrames. The most popular and also the most painful. By the way, does anyone remember Ning? Yeah. Okay, this is another example of open social. So I partnered with these folk back in the day. It's not really around anymore. They got acquired long ago. I think it was a technology acquisition. Don't quote me on that. I forget exactly what happened, but you're not going to see this anymore. This is a case of iframing. Benefits to iframing, obviously, is it's a free-for-all. So it's easy for you. It's easy for your partners. And it's a very flexible experience for your users. You're basically saying to your partners, whatever you can build on the web, we're just going to make it work within our dimensions, within just a space. All you have to do is make it work within, so many pixels in width, so many pixels in height, and that's it. A lot of challenges with this, though, mostly technical. Many platforms failed because the user experience wasn't great. But actually, when it came to iFrames, they did also just collapse because of technical reasons. Several of them just said, if you have more than one app installed, more than one integration installed, displayed on a page, there's a performance issue. That's improved a bit, but this is still something to really watch for iFrames. Also, very often security teams just come along, and if they have enough authority, they just say, heck no to iFrames. We're going to get more into security in a little bit. But yeah, there's that challenge of, they can do whatever they want. Also, what else has been going on in the last decade when it comes to user experience? iPhone. Mobile's become a bigger deal. And iFrames and mobile apps, they don't really get along. So this is something else we have to take into consideration as to what other options are out there that provide better security, better performance, and maybe better consistency, but also compatibility with mobile. So this is where something called cards comes along. Most likely, the folk here have seen this in Slack. Slack's platform team actually acknowledged to me that iframes were very commonly requested. And instead, they enable this to say, okay, we're going to let third parties in Slack appear in the Slack interface, but we're going to limit them to what they can do. We're going to give you a few different kinds of form-like objects, inputs, drop-downs, and you can select those, you can program on those, but you're not going to have a fully customized interface. You're not going to be allowed to have your own client-side code, JavaScript, running in our system. It's safer for us, but also, how many of you use the Slack mobile app? Show of hands here. Yeah, exactly. Slack, for many of us, Slack is used more on mobile than on the desktop. So they understood that they needed these apps to be mobile compatible. It's another little secret to Gmail as well. Gmail, when they enabled add-ons, part of it was likely a security concern, that they didn't want to iframe in and so you can put whatever you want inside of Gmail. But the other part is that they wanted these apps to be mobile friendly. And so they figured if we limit you to a certain set of objects that we know are going to work both in our web experience and in our mobile app, it's going to create a good solid experience. That's going to be better for the consumer. It's going to be better for the developer. Has anyone actually tried programming on Slack or programming a Gmail add-on? Okay, not too much enthusiasm here. I've gotten to work with quite a few developers. Several other companies that I advised especially were trying to integrate with Gmail. And here's an unfortunate situation with cards right now, though. It seems ideal for the modern platform to make it work on mobile, but the developers I know, when they get into these cards, they just find that it's too limiting today. Most of them are interested in, say, building a Gmail integration, and they like the idea of using the add-ons just to get on the mobile app for Gmail, but as they try to make it work, they eventually give up. and just build a Chrome extension to hack on top of Gmail for the desktop. The issue right now is that it's too limiting. Also, we don't really have standards. So if you're building a mobile app, if you're building a mobile add-on for Gmail, you're going to have to rewrite everything if it could fundamentally work in Slack. The way the cards work, there's no standard. They're doing their own thing. So what do we do here? We have these issues of security and performance, but then we have these issues of these just too restrictive options if we want to get around that. Well, unless it's too much of a security thing, some platforms are getting smart about this, and they figure out there are benefits of just going with cards to the extent that you can. Intercom basically provides both iFrames and cards. And the developer experience is such, they say to developers, use cards as much as you can, but if you can't use cards, if you hit too much of a barrier or limit with cards, okay, if necessary, you can iframe in. Some platforms are saying, okay, well, we have extensions that if you want to iframe in, it just won't work on mobile, it'll only work on the web, so try to make it non-iframe so that it can work both on mobile and on the web. But Intercom basically found that, yeah, iframes can work on mobile. They don't really like it. It's an okay experience. It's not great. And so they say, try to just use cards. So with that, you start to get a decent experience, the kind of consistency you want, good performance, and when necessary, enable the flexibility with the iframes. Finally, I encourage us to go beyond both of these because neither of them are the greatest options in all cases. The better platforms, once they think through the user problems, they get creative. What else can we do to make these integrations work? Over in Google Drive, you can right-click on a file and have it signed with HelloSign, or use Cloud Convert to convert a document to a PDF. You just right-click on a file, send it over. There's no iframing, there's no card. What they're doing is literally just opening up a new window, and they're calling a partner API saying, here's the file. Go work with the file. It's a really fun one if you're using something called app scripts. It's actually within Google Docs. They have add-ons, so you can actually perform operations inside of Google Docs. I have a good example. Actually, I think I'm going to show it now. I have a nice example of this. For fun, I kind of hack at this myself. So, give me a moment to find it here. Okay. So, I was in the mood to make it really easy as a product manager to create stories in a spreadsheet that I can just send straight into Trello. And so Trello happens to have a page where you can just open up that page, and if you put the right parameters into the URL, we're just going to automatically create a Trello card for you. And oh, can't we just make that work within Google Sheets? So I have a nice spreadsheet here. I've selected a column, and I want to create a ticket out of this column. And so from Google Sheets, that's it. We're over there. We're over from Google Sheets into Trello, and the card is basically auto-generated. I just need to save it to Trello board. This was done, by the way, with very, very little code. All I have to do is say, okay, Google Sheets, for this sheet, I'm going to create a menu, and when that menu is clicked, I'm going to go and grab some cells, and then I'm going to go and open a URL. That's it. It's actually hosted entirely in Google with something called app scripts, which we're going to get into in a moment. All right, so over time, basically, we figure out there are a lot of tools at our disposal when it comes to the user experience. As long as you gather that feedback and figure out how do you really make this work, what works well for our partners. Do we need iframe technology? Maybe not. Maybe we just need to have links and just send the user out to another page. That works too. There are quite a few options out there. Now, I've been talking mostly about the user experience and how to enable this for partners. iFrames, cards, triggers. Ultimately, it's all about what really is the best user experience, or, okay, the best user experience that your security team is going to be okay with. But we also have to talk about making this stuff actually easy for developers to use. Obviously, this is one way or another going to tie in with your APIs, but there's a lot more here than just APIs and iFrames, although a lot of it is just APIs and iFrames. So actually, where are we here? Okay, so actually a lot of it is just about APIs and iFrames. That's the basics. The way iGoogle worked, the way LinkedIn's Open Social integration worked, is we basically say, okay, we're going to let you have a web page that's in our app, and when your app is embedded, here's a user token, here's an access token, you can go make API calls. Although if we're smart about it, we may give you some special API calls that only really apply when you're embedded. Like over in Google Docs, maybe we're going to grab some content specifically within the document or write content to the document, and we can make that easier. When I was at Box, similar to Google Drive, you could right-click on a file, edit it in another tool, send it over to Docusign or HelloSign to get signed. When you would finish up over there, it would be nice if the other app, when they save a file back to Box or just want to let the user know that it's completed, that whatever they were doing is completed, they could send a message to us. And it was an API that would say, just post a notice in our interface that lets the user know that the task was completed. So we may actually have some APIs that trigger things in our interface. And that's really the first step. Allow apps to be embedded and have APIs to interact with the interface. The way I made the little plugin work with Google Docs, it's something like that. We basically have some code that says, go and create this menu in the Google Doc. So I'm programmatically tweaking the UI for Google Docs. That's specially enabled for this embedded framework called the Google Docs add-ons. Gmail has some similar things. If you're creating a Gmail add-on, there are certain things you can do in the Gmail interface that you can't just do through the external API. Okay, so that's step one. We're going to give you API access when you're embedded in our interface, and we may give you a couple extra APIs to work with our interface. The next obvious thing is just having libraries on top of your APIs. Okay, we generally know to do that for our APIs today, but it's especially helpful for the embedded frameworks. The way I coded that add-on for Google Docs, it's something called AppScript, which is basically just JavaScript with functions to call Google APIs. That's actually what most of these libraries are. Next to the iFrame or other embedded option and APIs, they just whip up a JavaScript library to call all of those APIs. This one isn't Google, this one's Shopify. They figured out the same thing. First, let partners integrate via iFrame or other means, give them the APIs to do that, and then let's make it easier by giving them a library, a set of functions. It looks kind of like a Shopify programming language. Google AppScript, you get to brand it like your own programming language, but pretty much all the time it's just client-side JavaScript that on top of that works with your APIs. So we can get to those libraries and say, okay, for a developer, when you're coding, and by the way, think about it, if it's a JavaScript library, you get to then write code that works with the platform. It's entirely client-side. That makes it easier for the developer to code something that you're hosting. Developers don't have to host that code elsewhere. That's no longer the biggest deal, as it's pretty easy to host server-side code on AWS, GCP, Azure. Not much to really worry about there, but it's kind of nice if you're able to code something very simple that's client-side. It makes those JavaScript libraries extra powerful. And then you get to that next layer of abstraction. Again, thinking through the user experience, what do the customers want, and also treating this like a product problem and saying, what are your developers trying to do? You start to see that developers are doing the same thing over and over again. They have to reinvent the wheel every time, and what they're doing every time also is creating a really crappy UI, a different UI. So they'll figure out, we don't want to force the UI on people. Okay, some do, that's why they do things like cards. But in other cases, it's just, we want to give you the flexibility to write whatever you want, but it would be nice if you build with our UI components. It'll make development easier for you, and then you're going to build apps that are more consistent with our UI. That was another challenge that happens with these interfaces. It's not just performance. It's not just security. If you're letting these third parties put in whatever they want on your site, it can start to look ugly if their own interfaces, they may be good interfaces, but they're not really jiving with what you have. So Shopify, Salesforce was big about this. They figured out the strategy of don't force anything on people, but encourage them. Once you figure out what kind of apps they're building, let's go and build some UI components. They'll be accessible in our API libraries, so you can very much faster build an app that has a nicer, more consistent interface. So there's a lot we have to think about when it comes to that developer experience. Some of it we've seen in other APIs, libraries, UI components, widgets. How do things work in the developer portal? If anyone's worked on OpenSocial in the past or on Salesforce versus, say, Facebook, sometimes we have to specify how do we define what our app is. Where is it embedded? Is it going to be on the user's profile page? What do we have access to? Most platforms say you're just going to do this with a manifest file. Easy enough. Others, like Facebook, think that you can take it one step further by having just an interface, like a little form on top of all of this. You can customize and tweak your settings. What I found in practice is that it doesn't really matter. Developers don't really care. But it's not that hard to actually create the interface. I was at one company where we didn't have the engineering time to actually build the interface, so I just said screw it and just kind of hacked together with HTML and JavaScript some sort of form that just spits out the JSON manifest. And initially, you could just use this to create your manifest and upload it somewhere else. Then we figured, okay, well, let's just use this to generate the manifest and store it in our system. But I'd say 90+% of the time, whatever custom stuff that you think you need in a manifest can be done on a form. That said, again, I've seen a lot of platforms where they do the manifest thing, and I say you may want to go to a form. It's not that hard, but they have the feedback from their developers. And I've seen it, developers who've worked on those platforms. How hard is it to build a manifest? Not really. So cool versus valuable, developers usually just don't care. And yes, there are times when you can't really create the form if there are some really custom things in that manifest. I find, though, most of the time, no matter how much you think that manifest needs to be customized, there's a pattern of what developers actually need, what their settings are. You can almost always create the interface. So I say really just, why not? It helps to boost the standards for these platforms. So how much time do we have? We have a good amount of time still. So we've talked about the user experience, the developer experience for these kind of iFrames, not just iFrames, these kind of frameworks, the various tools you can use. I've been slipping in that word security. For some of those platforms that chose to go by cards instead of iFrames, it was because, we want mobile compatibility. For others, I can't say who because they're hush-hush about, but they literally said, our security team just won't allow it. That's it. We had to use cards because it was the only option enabled for us. So to that, though, we have our options. But we have to certainly take these aspects into consideration. Anyone who works in APIs know that APIs are a source of, they're just a source of security holes. You learn a lot of dark secrets about Silicon Valley when you're working on other APIs and seeing where those holes are. In fact, several companies, again, can't say who, but large companies, more than a couple of them, have reached out to me at some point They had some sort of embedded framework or another API, and it had a security hole, and they got busted for it. And next thing I know, they reach out to me and they say, hey, Jeremy, can you help me find a technical writer or a developer advocate, because all of our developer advocates quit. So we definitely have to watch security here. Often when it comes to these embedded frameworks, security just comes and they say, heck no, you just can't do anything. But if you want to try for iFrames, on the Plus, there are some things you can do today for iFrames that we couldn't do years ago. We can put some restrictions on what developers are able to do. We might be able to say, restrict same origin, restrict scripts entirely, restrict access to pop-ups. So make sure that the partners, when they do integrate, they're not able to get out of that interface and create a pop-up or anything that's just kind of screwy with your UI. So you're able to provide some restrictions if you're going with iFrames. And that'll help you to advocate for these kind of APIs. Incidentally, I've had another company say that there's a HIPAA issue or a FINRA issue that prohibited them from iFrame integrations. That's basically where if some company says we require HIPAA certification, you may be HIPAA certified, but all these partners might not. Easy solutions there. One, which Salesforce did, at least for a long time, is to just say, okay, you're HIPAA certified, okay, we'll agree to just block all apps entirely. The other is to have a list of apps who have the HIPAA certification, the FINRA certification, and then if a customer says, we need HIPAA certification, okay, that's going to be an API restriction, that's going to be a marketplace restriction, so we're only going to show you and enable for you apps that are HIPAA compliant. So there are a lot of ways around these things, and that can help to advocate to your security team. We know what we need to do to still make this safe. At the same time, honestly, I'm still seeing a lot of really concerning things with these integrations. Like Google Drive, they've gotten better at this. But if you've ever installed a Google Drive app, you right-click the first time, you open up HelloSign or Airtable or something else, they're going to prompt you with an OAuth prompt to access certain things in Google Drive. And so it used to be that you'd have to give this app, like a file converter, a PDF converter, you'd have to give them full access to your Google Drive account. Yeah, to be able to one at a time convert a file. Okay, problem here is that the authentication scopes that we have in our APIs may not work as well for these kind of frameworks. Google Drive figured that out, which I'm happy to say Box knew about long earlier, that you can set the tokens to have, say, file-only access. So for Box, they made sure at the outset that if you allow these kind of integrations, if you had a document viewer, it had view-only access only to the files that you selected. You would send a file to Docusign to get signed. Docusign got a read-only permission to that file, and they were given a token that only worked with that file. If it was an editor, sure, they had the right to overwrite that file. They could save a new copy of that file, but they weren't able to see anything else in that folder. If they want access to the folder, they need to request additional permissions. Google's gotten better about enforcing those now to make sure that these partners, they only ask for file level access. So when you right click on a file, the partner only gets access to that file. Trello's got this too. Sometimes they say that a partner should only have access to the card that it's embedded on or the projects that it's embedded in. They have to make sure that that scope is properly limited to where that app is actually embedded. It, by the way, really comes up in social networks where you say, okay, this app, who gets to see the app? Do I have access to my friend's content? Even in Box or in Google Drive, it's collaborative content. So what do I give access to? Do I give any access to the information for someone who's a collaborator in my folder? These are things you really have to watch out for here. If these things are going to be visible to other people, maybe only some people have write access, some people have view access, you have to make sure all those scopes are taken into consideration. So there's a lot more we can talk about in terms of security, user experience, but I also just want to keep thinking ahead. We've talked about only a few options to enable these integrations. iFrames, cards, triggers. There's a lot more people are trying. There's a lot more that's working. There's a lot that's trending now. When I've spoken with people at Shopify, at Google, over at Trello, there are certain things that they emphasized. I asked them, if you're working on cards, have you thought about a standard for cards? Because, maybe it's more convenient if they're able to build once and apply it everywhere. And every single one, everyone I talked to on all these teams, they all said the same thing. They said, yeah, we'd love to do it, but honestly, we're just not ready. We need to get cards to work decently in the first place. We're not sure if cards are even going to work in the long term, so let's not talk about standardization. We're still experimenting. Unfortunately, with that lull and resurgence, these things are still kind of young. We're still figuring out what really works. And they all know they have to move the heck away from iFrames. But among those things that they're testing, my favorite one I'm looking forward to, have you all heard of AMP? HeavyBit's really big on AMP? All right. A few hands up, a few not. Basically, AMP is like a limited version of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's basically saying, we're going to let you iframe stuff into our interface. It's going to be HTML and JavaScript. It's just you're going to be doing a lot less than you would be able to do if you were just building your own website. AMP happens to be very mobile friendly. Based on the restrictions, it is safer than iFrames. And it is more flexible and overall just less crappy than going with cards. So I'm hoping to see more of this. What we're seeing now, you may have encountered AMP in Gmail, where so you get a Google Calendar invitation, you have the option to accept or reject right in Gmail. It started with that, but now other services are able to send you emails where in the email you could just click on something, enter form information, respond in the email itself. There's a little bit of HTML and JavaScript in that email, but not too much. It's limited. That's what AMP is. If you'll notice though, Gmail today, they allow that in the messages, but if you look at the platform, Gmail add-ons, it's not there right now. In fact, I'm not actually seeing AMP, admittedly, in any major developer platform today. What I can acknowledge is that every one of the teams that are working on those platforms, they're watching this and they're thinking about it. Kind of like, shouldn't say kind of like GraphQL now, but kind of like the early days of GraphQL. And yes, we are actually looking forward to standards, although there actually was one standard. It was just a really sucky standard. Did anyone here ever work on OpenSocial, by the way? Okay. Boy, kids these days, never had to deal with OpenSocial or SOAP APIs or having to ride a woolly mammoth to school. Yeah, so OpenSocial was actually an attempt back in the days when XML was still more popular than JSON. But basically, what will hopefully happen over time, they're all looking forward to this, be it iFrames, be it cards, be able to say, just like JSON's overtaking XML and APIs, just like Swagger and OpenAPI creating a standard by which we define RESTful APIs. They want to start showing more of a standard for embedded frameworks so that when you're building in one platform, most of your stuff can be reused in another platform. AMP may help with that. What we really just need to see is more experimentation, some solidification. So any of you, as you work on your platforms, just join the unofficial community and talk with other platform hosts to see what they're testing. Because as you share your success, what you're going to get to then is actually cooperation between the companies and more towards a standard. It's what the successful companies today are hoping to do. It's very early, but for those working on a platform, keep a lookout because everyone's betting on something happening here. Yeah. And with that, I just say keep dreaming. Hopefully we'll get to a standard, but for now, we're just trying what works now that we're starting to get user experiences and developer platforms well aligned. So just keep testing things out And hopefully one day too, we'll actually see a Google Calendar integration with Gmail that actually does what we want it to do. That's really it for me for today. Thank you all for putting up with me for 45 minutes. Anyone have any questions? Yes. So I think just like with an iFrames, that can help out. So we'll see where that trends. But the latest that I've seen was more of a push towards AMP. That combined with the extra little bits of security around iFrames, but I think that can help. The closest thing we've seen near term instead is okay, we're gonna let you code. Well, it's actually more like cards where some say, okay, it's iframed in, but we're going to give you those UI components that you can choose to grab and hopefully utilize. The others, which is cards, is basically you have to utilize it and then program on top of that. But yeah, I think that's going to help then to alleviate the, that's where we are bringing back iframes. We're all kind of trying to move away from it, but what may just happen is it just becomes safer and safer to iframe with restriction. You also brought up a good point, though it wasn't your main question, on analytics. Yeah, if you're doing cards, AMP, you're kind of restricted on some data. This can be another talk, but when it comes to marketplace management, there's another company I advise that's actually all about running the app marketplaces. Namely, the app marketplaces for companies that are launching these embedded experiences. And so what happens there is, in most of those cases, it's iframed in, so the partners can actually run their own analytics, but very often it's actually the platform's responsibility to collect usage data. And maybe they have more information on the user sessions that they're okay sharing that actually gives them even more power than what you would get from your own analytics. So some of it is the platform itself actually providing analytics information to the partner. And that becomes a whole other, how do you do that? How do you make that accessible to the partner? Do you want to do it visually? Do you want to just give them some access to bulk data? But that's a whole other thing. Yeah, so I matched that with cards. It's similar to cards, except much of it is automated, that they can just extract the data. And there are some benefits to that. If you want to say, often platforms do open that up to say, if you provide the right metadata, we will allow you to, when someone is dropping in a link, display something custom. Actually, does anyone remember Gmail contextual gadgets? Exactly. As you can see, I really love playing with all these things, and then very often nothing ever comes of them. So Gmail has add-ons today. That's where you can integrate a third-party tool into the sidebar and into the compose window of Gmail. But they used to have something where if you had a link to say, they do have it within, I think it's still a Gmail Labs feature, that if there's a link to a YouTube video, you can actually view the YouTube video in Gmail. And if you have a link to Yelp, they'll actually pull up the Yelp profile of that venue in the email. For a while, they had that opened up. So Box was tempted to have something where if you have a link to a Box file, we will embed a preview of the Box file right in the email. They deprecated it and shut it down a long time ago. Now, admittedly, part of it in their case, they didn't do a good job marketing it, distributing it, making it easily accessible. So I think there is a lot of opportunity, and this is actually a place where cards really make sense, where in those experiences, if it just happens to be a URL to your site, we can give you what you need to just display something right there. It's convenient. So that's where, over time, both iFrames, cards, they're still evolving, they're still experimenting, and we're probably still going to have use cases for both. Okay, well, one quick tip, and we'll see if this sparks any more questions while I'm still up here. So we've talked about how it's easy to create, when you have a JavaScript library, many developers can code entirely client-side integrations. And maybe you can even just host it yourself. It's convenient for the developer. Sometimes you don't want to do that. So I was once working for an education tech company. It's called Edmodo. You all familiar with Blackboard or Compass? Okay, this is how I better gauge my age group. Now, these are old products, but everyone's still stuck on those. Okay, so Edmodo was in that space. So it was basically A teacher could sign up, create an online classroom. They were still teaching in class, but it was a place where they could post homework assignments, message their students. The students could get the homework assignment online and submit their homework assignment online. And we enabled there an embed platform where a teacher could say, find a math game, an online math game, install for the classroom, and then assign that math game to their students. The students would then get the homework assignment, they click a link, it would open up the math game in an iFrame and in Modo. The student would play the game. If they did well, it could actually submit a grade to the gradebook. So we had our iFrames, we had this whole marketplace, we had our libraries on top of our APIs, and we had those APIs to let the iFrames interact. An app could, say, submit a grade to the gradebook after it ran. Now, when it comes to these marketplaces, there's a lot of manual work for developer advocates. You have to test these apps to make sure they're secure, the user experience is solid, there's no privacy issue, especially in education technology when we had classrooms with third graders. And we had to warn many of the app developers if they coded too much there that was client-side. Like there could be a vocabulary or spelling test kind of thing, something for an English class, where you may encounter a student who's not really great at an English class, but is actually really good at math and programming. And they could look at the code and see what is the API call to submit the grade to the gradebook. So that's what we had to warn in that case, as convenient as it is, and as convenient as we were making it to actually write code client-side, they probably didn't want to do that. For those who want to benchmark, a few good examples I'd highlight. Shopify, they're really solid, but it's kind of a heavy platform today, so not the best start. Trello, I find, is a very simple one, very straightforward. They got the user experience right, they got security right, they're using modern systems, it's just iFrames, JSON manifest, they're making small updates, but it's a very straightforward iFrame plus APIs. So if you just want to get started, that's a good one. Intercom, I really like because they figured out the cards plus the iFrame and how to make that work conceptually. Also, I'm a big fan of Google's G Suite. That's Google Drive, Google Docs, namely for where they made it work in their experience. Their use of app scripts, you can really code right in their system. It's all client-side, but they're hosting the code. Now, a challenge for Google's G Suite, they kind of acknowledge it, is there are inconsistencies. If you create a Gmail add-on, they use cards. It works on mobile. If you create a Google Docs add-on, it's iFrame today. Now, that's partly because they were just two separate initiatives, and so they're inconsistent. But if you talk with a team, you can see it's trending. They're starting to bring it all together. So what you'll get out of Google is the idea of the different options, cards, iFrames. Where does it fit in a user experience? Those triggers, coding client-side. The experience overall, they're good, but you can see little parts where it's just not flowing together today. Clearly they're working on it, so it's not the best there, but it's trending in the positive. And Google definitely has been one of the, I would say one of the innovators in modern options for these embedded frameworks. Thank you all again. I'll be around for additional questions.